Hi, and good afternoon to everyone joining us from Europe, and good morning to everyone joining us from the United States. So maybe good evening to all of you joining us from Asia. Thanks for joining our weekly LinkedIn broadcast on sanctions and trade compliance updates. And this week, we decided to do an update on the 11th package of EU sanctions that have been published last week or introduced last week. Let me quickly check how we can present the presentation that we prepared for you. Yeah, thank you. Our guest speaker today, Pierre, was just with us, is joining us now. Hi, Pierre. Hi, back again.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone.
Perfect. I thought we lost you for a second. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I think we had 22 registrations via LinkedIn, so thanks for joining us. Today's agenda is as follows. We will look at the timeline of EU sanctions, just to give you a perspective of all the 11 packages that we have seen so far. And then we dive into the key measures of the 11th package that you have seen maybe last week being published. And a lot of commentary has been published on it already. And then we will receive some of your questions at the end if you have any questions. So you should be able to submit your questions on LinkedIn in the comment section, and they will come into our comment section. It will be visible to us a couple of seconds later. So I will see if you submit any questions at the end, and we'll try to answer them. Thanks, Pierre, for joining us again. We've done this broadcast, I believe, 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, and we discussed the proposed 11th package, and now it's actually official. So let's look at the timeline first. Maybe you can guide us through the timeline and give us your comment. I'm interested what you think about the amount of time that it took the EU this time to publish this package.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's the key point. If you look at the timeline, of course, if you look back last year, we had a lot of packages in a very close time frame. But if you look at this one, and this was actually the expectation before, normally within the European Union, because we have 27 member states, it will take a while before anything can pass. Well, actually, looking back last year, it was proven wrong. The European Union was able to actually pass a lot of packages within a very short time frame. But now with the 11th, it actually took a while. I remember the last broadcast, we were already anticipating on what might be in the package. And still it took a couple of weeks before it was actually finalized. So that actually shows that there are so many sanctions and measures already in place that the room to maneuver within the European Union is becoming more difficult. But nevertheless, successfully, this 11th package was passed. And I think that's the main topic as well of today's broadcast.
Yeah. I think that the only thing that I found in the discussions as to why it took so long was a list that the Ukrainian government wanted to publish with companies cooperating with or still working and doing business in Russia. And those companies were also located in Hungary or the Czech Republic. And those two countries said, our companies should not be on that list, that Ukrainian list. So it was a political discussion, and it was very sensitive. And I believe at the end, Ukraine decided to drop these companies from its list. And those countries vowed to put pressure on companies in the EU that are still doing business with Russia to stop those, to stop doing business. Of course, this is a purely political opinion and nothing that has been published as just to the reason, I think, of why it took a bit longer, right? Political disagreements on the measures, because we had so many measures already. It's the 11th package, so you have to dig deeper into the technology and the products, into the goods that need to be restricted or the people that need to be designated, and it just takes longer to decide on those.
It does, and what we have seen, I think, in all of the packages, the first couple of packages last year, the focus was in putting a lot of people, names, and persons on the sanctions lists. Now, of course, every package we do see again a number of persons, entities added to the list, but also there is a large focus on the sectoral sanctions against Russia. And of course, the technicalities. So the discussions are becoming more technical, and that makes it also more difficult because what else can be sanctioned? What doesn't work? Is there any information about the effectiveness of the measures already in place? So that makes it more difficult. So that also explains why it did take longer than we expected initially.
Yeah. Okay. This presentation is structured based on sanctions types, basically. We will look at some trade measures and then some transport measures, energy-related measures, and some additional listings, and then some other measures at the end. So I believe we have around 5 slides with new measures. So let's quickly walk through those measures together. What is your take on the new trade measures, Pierre?
Yes, so indeed, a couple of trade measures. I think in the last broadcast, we already shortly touched upon the anti-circumvention tool and measures. We know that there already have been a lot of measures against Russia directly, trading with Russia and different products, technologies, etc. But we have seen that circumvention, which we also seen with other sanction regimes, also took place with these sanctions. So there was a lot of discussions. Okay, what else can we do if we look, for instance, at countries, at different technologies, products, etc. And the focus was indeed on how can we focus more on preventing circumvention of sanctions. So therefore, indeed, a new tool was also launched. We also have, of course, the extension of the transit prohibition, which has been extended now for a while again. Also here within the trade measures, an addition of 80 plus new entities. Also important, of course, are the tightening of restrictions on imports of iron and steel goods. Previously, of course, they have already been touched upon in the previous packages. That has been tightened now. We also see, and that's maybe a little bit of a side note compared to these measures, that certain EU member states also decided to impose a little bit more strict measures in regards to custom controls, especially if you look at countries like Lithuania, Latvia, of course, which border Russia. They have decided to also come with some additional local measures. If you look at the general EU trade measures again as well, extension of the ban on export of luxury cars. We know that luxury cars, if you look at the general sanction areas and sanctions against, for instance, North Korea, we know that this was, of course, always a hot topic, how those luxury cars end up in North Korea. So this is also something that within this package against Russia also played a role. And of course, what is also important is the full ban now on certain types of machinery components, which also has been added to the list. And finally, the simplifying of the structure of the industrial goods annex. So what we see, I think, in all those packages, all those changes, is that constantly they're changing the wording or the annexes and the technicalities in the measures against Russia.
What I find interesting in this new package is the extension of the transit prohibition. It says to make it more difficult for Russia to use the goods that are transiting via Russia to third countries. It was a bit surprising to me to hear that is still possible, because we have customs checking everything now going to Russia, and there's still basically trucks loaded with goods probably transiting through Russia. Just to think of one example, if you export something via Russia, where would those products go to? Like, in which case do you need to use Russia as a transit?
I think normally, pre-Russia sanctions, the only logical reason would be to use Russia if you're located close to Russia, to transport certain goods to other countries like Kazakhstan or any other neighboring countries, which of course is quicker through Russia. But of course, the trade normally the biggest level of trade is with Russia itself. Although we have seen, and then touching upon also the circumvention bit, is we have seen an increase of trade with former Soviet Union countries like Kazakhstan, indeed, Uzbekistan, and others.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, which we will cover in another broadcast. the red flags related to neighboring Russian countries, which we will do next week. Okay, let's move on to the transport measures.
Yeah, so in transport measures, of course, we already had a lot of measures in place. What is new now in this package is the full ban on trucks with Russian trailers, but also semi-trailers that transport goods to the EU. We see also the prohibition to access EU ports. This is also not new, but what is new is more the specifications. So the notification or actually notifying competent authorities at least 48 hours in advance for them also to be able to do the checks on the goods on those ships. And also the prohibition to access EU ports for vessels which potentially might manipulate or turn off the navigation tracking system. This is also a well-known method, of course, of circumventing sanctions by just turning off the navigation tracking system. So not a lot of new things also in this area in transport measures. It's more making it more specific and a little bit more strict compared to the previous packages. But there's not a lot of new developments in these transport measures.
Just a hypothetical question. I try to imagine Russian trailers or semi-trailers entering the EU through the border in Lithuania or Estonia, for example. There are still products that are imported into the EU, which is not sanctioned. How would that work practically if a Russian trailer is not able to enter the EU? Would it be a logistics provider that is not Russian carrying those goods?
Exactly. Yeah. So it should be a vessel which does not is a non-Russian vessel, or indeed a distributor that is able to transport that is not sanctioned.
Yeah. Okay. In the meantime, I see we received 2 questions. If we just cover the first question, how the new anti-circumvention tool will be put in place. Thank you, Asma, for your question. Do you have any idea, Pierre, how that would practically work?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So there are many layers to this one. Still, I think the details are still not 100% known, but it's a combination of different factors. There are, of course, some parts which the European Commission is publishing. There's already a lot of information on how you can use the tool. Previously, already there have also been like a whistleblower platform where also cases of anti-circumvention or basically circumvention can also be reported if that's the case. So it has many layers. So I think going into the specifics might take pretty long, but I think it's definitely an interesting question, which pretty soon there will also be some publications on the more specifics of the anti-circumvention tool.
Yeah, I believe that this was a first important step for the EU to actually agree on a framework for a new tool. And this is usually the first step to something that is biting more. It's not biting yet, but it will be used probably to put pressure on third countries and companies within those third countries still doing business with Russia that are importing products from the EU. And if proven, if those products mistakenly end up in Russia and we're not supposed to end up there, the EU will at least have this framework to start designating those parties. Thank you for your question, Asma. Another question we received is, it seems that the EU FAQs have not been updated yet with those latest updates.
Correct.
Do you think that's maybe it takes a couple of days for the EU to update all the FAQs?
It does, yeah, and that's actually the case. I also double checked in these this morning, and it indeed hasn't been updated yet. Well, we know that normally it does take some time to update the Q&As. So that's definitely the case. They're working hard, at least the European Commission, to update those Q&As. And we expect also soon to have the updates based on the 11 package.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's move on to the energy measures.
Yes. So looking at the energy measures, so Of course, one of the main things is the end of the possibility to import Russian oil through the pipelines for Germany and Poland. We know, of course, there have been many developments on the different pipelines, but now there was always a little bit of a possibility still to import oil. That has now been ended with this 11th package. If we look at the other main topics were, of course, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which is the pipeline that transports Kazakh oil to the EU through Russia. This has also been restricted, so there will be very targeted derogations on these and bans as well. And finally, the extension of the exception to the oil price cap from the Sakhalin oil from Japan. And of course, as we can imagine, these sanction packages, the EU took longer compared to, for instance, the US, the UK, but even Japan, because there have been a lot of deliberations with these partner countries. So this is also something, of course, that was part of the discussions and part of the 11th package.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to an overview of some additional listings and new designation criteria for people who can be listed.
Exactly. So the previous measures were focusing more on the sectoral sanctions. If we look at the territorial integrity sanction regime, then we see an additional 100 additional individuals and entities. Most of them are decision makers on the war, senior military officials, judges, but also we see a little bit more trend and focus on Russian IT companies. I think this is a pretty new compared to the previous listings. So you see it shifting, where initially it was, of course, more the political functions, the Duma parliamentary members, the oligarchs. Now we see more targeted shift on different sectors, but also again banks operating in the occupied territories like Crimea and other areas. And finally, entities working with the Russian armed forces. So what didn't have an impact, of course, we know that not long ago also we had the Wagner Group, which also, of course, played a big role in marching towards Moscow. But of course, most of the Wagner Group members have already been sanctioned, so we don't see development in that area. But indeed, again, a focus on adding more people to the list based on new information.
Okay, thank you. And then the last slide on some other measures.
Yeah, I think also in general, what makes the Russian-related sanctions pretty unique is also the focus on the media ban. So again, an additional 5 channels have been added. I think the most of the famous ones previously that have been added were, of course, RT. So again, what we do see here is that it's the non-Russian based subsidiaries or organizations part of these media organizations. For instance, I believe the Arab version and others, which have been added now. So it's basically to block any misleading information coming from the Russian regime, from Putin, to the rest of the world to ban access to them. Also, additional provisions on information exchange and reporting. And finally, the temporary derogation, which has been inserted, to allow the provision of prohibited services, which could have been legally required from divestment of Russian operators from the EU. So again, a little more strict measures also in this area.
Yeah, thanks. Just to look back on 11 packages of sanctions, right? I wonder, how do you see the latest package? Do you think it was a large package, or do you think it was something we expected to be published? And is this something that surprised you in this package?
Well, I think also looking back at our previous broadcast, of course, we already had some information, so no new surprises compared to 2 to 3 weeks ago. So from that point of view, no big surprises, I think. But we do see a focus, what I mentioned before, with the adding the listings of individuals and entities, a focus more in the IT sector, which is in line, of course, with the expectations. We see a lot of developments if you look at goods and technologies, development of drones, dual-use goods, that also the IT sector plays a role there. So that I think is one of the developments here. The other changes are indeed the focus on non-Russian related businesses and entities, how to deal with those. That has been, I think, one of the longest and most difficult discussions. Can you also sanction, for instance, entities that do business with Russia that are not based or are not Russian companies? Can those be sanctions as well, or do you need to take other measures? So that, I think, was a big discussion. But you do see a slow development into that area. And of course, the focus on circumvention. So we know that circumvention always takes place. Previously, of course, with countries like North Korea and Iran, which are smaller economies, but are pretty much already high risk. But Russia was closely linked to a lot of European countries, the US and others. That makes it more difficult. And on the other hand, also the business that Russia does in a lot of countries, like in African countries, Asian countries. So it was expected that they would use a lot of circumvention methods. And that also makes it logic that from a sanction perspective, that there will be a bigger focus on how to look at those circumvention methods.
Yeah, I completely agree on the circumvention part, especially because I noticed how large the focus was on the countries that are now suspected of being used as evasion countries, right? I mean, the statistics of so many news articles that I've seen that have been published in the past few weeks of the huge increase in imports from countries like Germany, for example, to Georgia, Armenia, or Kyrgyzstan, and everybody just wondering what exactly is happening in those countries that they suddenly have a 770% increase of imports from
Exactly.
Germany, which
Yes.
is unexplainable from a rational point of view. So you basically think of sanctions right away and sanctions evasion. So that focus is really exciting because those countries are bordering with Russia, and the EU needs to do outreach now to those countries to make sure that the customs works and that goods that are not supposed to end up in Russia are staying where they are supposed to stay at the end user. So
No,
that's
exactly. And I think that also adds a layer of complexity to EU operators, is that they need to conduct more enhanced due diligence when not only looking at Russia as an element, exporting to Russia, importing, but also indeed to the neighboring countries. And of course, a lot of business can still be legitimate, but it definitely is a trigger, or at least, well, not always a red flag, but at least it's a trigger, an indicator to look further, because we know there have been a lot of publications from investigative journalists that a lot of Russian entrepreneurs and business owners have actually opened new businesses in neighboring countries, so owned by Russians,
right.
but based in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, even in Turkey and other countries. So there's definitely an extra layer for EU operators to double check who is actually owning the business, when was it incorporated, etc. So that's definitely a very interesting area, maybe for a future broadcast to really dive into what are actually the red flags and indicators to look at.
Thanks. In the meantime, we received 2 questions from our attendees. I will just read them out. On whom lies the responsibility to ensure that a good is not exported to Russia or for use in Russia? For example, a Russian resident visiting the EU is buying a luxury good. How companies are due to ensure that goods won't be exported or be used in Russia?
Yeah, I think that's a valid question. So the principal responsibility lies with the EU operators themselves. So the moment they export certain goods, of course, they need to know if they need to have a license to export those products, is it dual use, etc. But they also need to know who is the end user. So there's a main responsibility in the whole chain. So there's no one in the chain that can say, well, I'm not the end distributor. There are different parties in the chain and they need to do the checks. It's even the first entity or party in the chain that needs to conduct its own due diligence and has its own responsibility. So it's the whole chain, actually. Even more, I had a discussion not so long ago. Also, even if you look at financial services linked to export controls, for instance, or certain goods that are exported or imported to or from Russia, if you provide financing or insurance, then even if you don't export yourself, but still you have a responsibility as well. So I think the bottom line is everyone in the chain has a responsibility to comply with the sanctions regulations.
And then the example of a Russian resident flying to Amsterdam or London and buying a diamond ring or something of value, can that person export it in his suitcase to Russia?
That was actually one of the cases that happened a lot, especially if you look at the first packages last year, that a lot of people actually, they traveled to London or any other city in Europe, bought luxury goods and just filled in their suitcases and then sold it back when arriving in Russia. So definitely also there, and that makes it more difficult because they are doing it themselves. There's no distributor or exporter that's involved. But that's definitely something for customs or airlines to do checks. Although it's very difficult, of course, for Russian individuals or citizens to travel to or from the European Union. But there are some workarounds which I know of, which are being used as well. So there are many ways that they can try to circumvent these sanctions.
Yeah. I think this question is also related to general customs rules and regulations saying what a person is allowed to carry from the EU to Russia. Despite the sanctions, there's a certain limit on cash, for example, always,
Yes.
on alcoholic beverages, and probably also on jewelry. But buying it in Europe, if you're Russian, is probably not an export by the European company to that Russian. It's
No.
still within the EU.
It is definitely a way to circumvent if indeed they are buying it in Europe and even more at the airport and then entering it in their luggage or the suitcases. Then it's very difficult to check that even as a customs agent. But of course, the volume, of course, is pretty small compared to the large containers or transports that initially went to Russia or import from Russia to the European Union.
Yeah. And one last question. How do EU sanctions apply to companies outside of the EU, which are owned by EU-based companies, such as EU subsidiaries?
Yeah, I think also a valid question. I think the basic rule with EU sanctions is that if the subsidiaries, non-EU based subsidiaries, they in principle do not need to comply with EU sanctions. But of course, there might be some pressure from the headquarters or the parent company, which is based in the EU, which can, of course, impose their own global policies to their global subsidiaries. But the principal rule is if there is a subsidiary in an African, South American, or Asian country, or at least a non-EU country, in principle, they do not fall under the EU sanctions, and they do not need to comply with EU sanctions.
Okay. Thanks a lot for all your questions. I hope you enjoyed this broadcast about the 11th sanctions package by the EU that has been published last week. Please join us next week again. We will publish the next week's broadcast soon, probably tomorrow, with the topic red flags exporting to Georgia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. As we discussed today, sanctions evasion is a huge topic at the moment. And if you are exporting to countries that are neighboring Russia, we want you to be vigilant and provide you with the red flags so you can check whether your exports or transactions might be at risk of violating any sanctions or export control regulations. So please watch out for the upcoming events being published on LinkedIn and also our website. And thanks, Pierre, for your time. Always a pleasure to do broadcast with you. I'm sure we will work together again. To everyone else, have a great start into the week, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everyone.